Good Yontif. A letter from a congregant to her rabbi. Dear Rabbi, I'm a member of your congregation trying to decide if I will stay in the community this year. I've been a lifelong member of Jewish communities. I've studied Jewish text and Hebrew and Israel. I am still young, but I am an alumna of your youth programming. I am one of yours. But this summer, I walked out of the synagogue in the middle of services for the first time. Listening to a rabbi give her Friday night sermon, I watched and listened as she pivoted from the Torah portion to her support of legislation against the boycott of Israeli products, known as BDS. My generation, the millennial generation, knows a different Israel than our parents. My generation didn't grow up in the victorious wake of the '67 war. None of this means that we aren't Zionists. I am a Zionist, but I do not share my mother's or my grandmother's Zionism. And yet, it sometimes feels like our Jewish communities are staging a witch hunt against those of us who dare to use the word occupation. Our nifty regions silence us. Our Hillels kicked us out. Our professional Jewish community leaders fear that we will be publicly outed as anti-occupation. For the record, I am not a supporter of BDS. I am currently sitting in a Jerusalem cafe, sipping Israeli coffee, next to my Israeli backpack and my Israeli cell phone. 27 members of my family are in the Israeli workforce and rely on this country's economy. I want you to remember that we are you. We are a generation raised by you and your institutions. You taught us the value of inclusion, along with those of democracy and equality. You taught us to be critical thinkers, to question dominant voices, to challenge authority. You taught us to be lovers of Torah, of Israel, and of the Jewish people. Signed with love, your congregant, Leah. Leah is not a congregant at this Temple Israel, and the sections of her letter that I just shared were not written to me as her rabbi. But I will tell you, she is by no means alone in her sentiments. I've received emails with variations of this letter, read Facebook posts to this effect, and heard consistently from rabbis and other congregations that letters such as this are not unique anymore. What Leah describes is what Rabbi Benny Lappy calls a crash, in her crash theory, which I've come to love and admire. Crash theory is the belief that each of us has a master story, a story that informs our perspective on the world. What Leah wrote to her rabbi, whether she intended it or not, was a warning. Zionism is on a crash course. Sitting in one car are the boomers. In the other car are the millennials. In one car are the Zionists who defend Israel at all costs. In the other are those who criticize Israel often. Generationally, rabbinically, I find myself in the middle. And I am worried. We are headed for a generational crash, a politically motivated crash, a crash that separates a grandmother's Zionism from her granddaughter's love of Israel. A separation that separates Lador Vador, what we have always tried to keep together, one generation from the next. So what I offer this morning is my response to Leah's letter, but more importantly, my hope that we can avoid this crash. According to Lappy, the author of Crash Theory, there are 3 causes for a crash, and there are 3 paths out of it. But only one path allows us to survive. We'll get there in a minute. Crashes happen, she says, when 2 versions of the truth collide. So when we teach you, our children, that Israel was a land for a people without a land, how the swamps that are north of Jaffa were turned into Tel Aviv, it collides with the story of an Arab family who still has the key to the home they evacuated in 1948. our narratives crash because the two truths collide. The second reason a crash happens is when our beliefs hit the wall of history. The belief, for instance, that Israel is the underdog, the small guy, the David, and the world is the Goliath. Yet, Israel has a thriving economy built on world-class education and innovation. It has an army that is undefeated in war after war after war. And so, history crashes. We are not the weak, fragile, young nation we thought we were. We are strong militarily, economically, educationally, and we gain more allies, especially Arab ones, every year, it seems. Perhaps most challenging, the third reason for the crash of morality. This is the crash that occurs when you realize that what you thought was the right thing to do no longer, in Lappy's words, meshes with your internal morality, with what we would call in Yiddish, your kishkas. This is the crash of the continued occupation that Leah wrote of in her letter. It's the crash that hurts the most. Israel has always been set on being a safe haven for the Jewish people and others, a place of refuge where Jews and Jewish culture can thrive, perhaps the only place of refuge where Jews and Jewish culture can always thrive. For me personally, and even as I look strategically, I do not question the occupation. I am not an Israeli citizen, nor am I an expert on national security. But morally, like all casualties in war, it makes me uncomfortable. Like many of you, I've learned to live with some of that discomfort. We've seen that discomfort in our own country. We've seen it as we've watched wars happen. They are not pretty. But Leah's letter is a warning to us that the discomfort I've learned to live with, her generation may not. They are experiencing a moral crash as we tell them that Israel is a light unto the nations, quoting the prophets, while their friends, their mentors, their professors use words like apartheid, racist, violator of human rights to describe the Jewish state. It is a moral crash for them. None of us want these crashes to happen. Most of us tell ourselves probably that they shouldn't happen, that this is somehow wrong, unusual. But the fact is, they always happen. We are always on a crash course. So let's not spend our energy in shock that what we thought was true about Israel is not the entire story, or perhaps not the story at all. That's always the case. Study American history, study European history, study our history. Our stories are incomplete at best and often mythical at worst. To some degree, that is inevitable and out of our control, but what is in our control is our response. And so, just as there are three causes for crashes, Rabbi Lappy explains, there are three potential responses. What Leah describes in her elders, and particularly in Jewish institutions, is what Lappy calls path one, the path of denial. Lappy describes denial as building walls to make sure nothing challenges our story. Leah explained it as Hillels, synagogues, Zionist organizations refusing to hear any opinion other than their own. We choose this option when we are afraid. When we are, in this case perhaps, afraid of being right in the fears we've held around Israel. Fear that the Jewish state is fragile. And so to Leah and her peers, I ask you, be patient with us. When your elders and our long-established Jewish institutions build walls, we need you to help us take them down. But I implore you, don't tear them down. Don't boycott us. Don't threaten us by walking out or insist that you are on the verge of leaving our community as you did. Our barriers are simply reflections of our fear. We need young, educated Zionists like you to remind us how strong we are. We need you to affirm your commitment to Israel, even if that commitment comes with critique. As you stated, your view of Israel is different from ours. We must include your new, nuanced perspective. So I implore you to include our older, time-tested perspective as well. Make room for us. Our story is a story that has seen more war than peace, and that does not take victory for granted as your story might. If we are quick to rebut even the smallest critique of Israel, it is because we have seen too much loss and we have feared far worse. Having seen the Holocaust, having seen the backs of too many countries as they turned away from our aid, we have built walls and we fear losing the greatest Jewish creation of our lifetime. Understand that for many, Israel is our source of Jewish identity and security. It is both our parent in its protection of us and our child in that we feel we helped give birth to it. So I ask you, Leah, and your friends, be gentle as one would be with a parent who sees their child moving away. But don't give up. Don't give in. When Jewish institutions, whether it be synagogues or Hillels, leading Zionist organizations like AIPAC or J Street put up walls, I hope you will continue the dialogue. You're right to call us out because we are far often too set in our ways and afraid of what the future holds. But you have an opportunity to save us from the first reason that cultures crash, because they are so tied to their story that they deny anything else. And perhaps we can save you from the second reason that they crash. If one extreme is to hold too tight to the stories we learned when we were children, the other is to believe only in the story that we learned last week. This is the car that we often find Leah and her peers driving. Although I would include recent people of fame, John Oliver, Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream, and a couple members of the U.S. Congress. Lappy refers to this as throwing the baby out with the bathwater. When we only accept the narrative of the crash and reject the entirety of the previous story, we don't survive the crash either. For those of you who are our parents and grandparents who have a Zionism that remembers the voices of Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, I turn to you. We need you to be better teachers. The generations of American Jews who witnessed the wars of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s are not only our parents, grandparents, and current leaders of Jewish institutions, you're also the Jews who walked with King and Heschel for civil rights in America. You're the generation of Jewish leaders who knows Israel and the American civil rights movements as siblings. Burned into your memories are the images of a world that refused to hear the cries of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, that abused Russian Jews, that expelled us from homes in Arab countries. You remember with your own eyes the murdering of Israeli civilians on buses, in grocery stores, and at the Olympics. And you are the generation who knows firsthand what it means for a racist governor of Alabama to organize men in uniform to beat down peaceful protesters, marching against discrimination across a bridge. I use this example on purpose because when late-night TV talk show hosts and liberal politicians point to pictures of an Israeli in uniform fighting a group of people in street clothes, they are calling upon a history of white people in power in uniform with weapons and politicians behind them abusing people of color. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a lot of things, but it is not Alabama of the 60s, nor is it South Africa of the 80s. Racism exists in Israel as it does in America. When you paint a picture that presumes groups like Hezbollah and Hamas are civilians simply because they wear jeans and that the IDF are aggressors because they wear a uniform and they follow orders, you are throwing out far more than the baby with the bathwater. And there are no better teachers for this than the generation of Zionists who are facing the criticism today. You who faced it in generations past. You have the ability to face this criticism that Israel is an apartheid state, a racist state, a state that does not know how to treat human beings, because you're the generation of Jews who led the marches in the 60s, who fought for peace in the 70s, who brought refuseniks out of the Soviet Union in the 80s. You are the best teachers we could have for this moment. So I ask that you bring your voices to this conversation with your children and grandchildren. Don't let them carry this burden alone on their backs. If we want to survive this crash, we cannot deny the history that no longer holds, nor can we paint Israel with the broad strokes of 20th century racism. We share in our prayer book these words: Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, shine a new light upon Zion, v'nizkeh kulanu meheira le'oro, that we may all swiftly merit its radiance. The third path: once we stop the crash that's happening within our community, it's this third path that allows us to survive the crash of the greater cultures. Lappy describes it as one where we retell the original truths in light of the crash. It provides a new set of working answers, but it works on the same original questions. The story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a story of peoplehood. It is the story not of one people without a land, but two peoples without a land, both Jew and Palestinian. It is a story of how these two peoples, with all of their history, must learn to coexist. And that's the story we must tell together. But we have to speak the same language if we're going to do so. Professor Joshua Holo from Hebrew Union College explains this with one question. When speaking of Israel, whether you're speaking with Jews or with your Arab friends or with others, know which war you are discussing. A young liberal American rabbinical student under his studies met with a group of Palestinian women in Israel. And she commiserated with the women about the Israeli occupation of Arab-majority land in the West Bank, the land that Israel won in the War of '67. But one of the Arab women interrupted her, sternly corrected the student. No, it's not '67 that we mourn, but the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. If we are to shine a new light on Zion, a light that will lead to peace, we have to make sure that the people we are looking to partner with are arguing over the same war we are. When our friends or our favorite ice cream boycott Israeli products, which war are they fighting? Is it the War of '48, the war for the Jewish people to have the right to exist, to defend themselves against a world that tried to exterminate them? If so, I do not know how to have that debate with you, because I cannot debate whether my people deserve to exist on this planet or not. But if it is the War of '67, the war that determined where lines are drawn and how two people should live side by side with respect for each other's autonomy, that is a debate that we can have, and we are ready. We can talk about whether the lines were put in the right place, whether Palestinians have been given the opportunity of self-determination. We can talk about mistakes that we may have made and reparations we need to make, but we cannot debate our right to exist. We can agree that Israel isn't perfect, that Zionism is flawed and in need of correction, but Israel for Jews, like Palestine for Palestinians, has a right to be in this world. Our lives depend on it, and we cannot let that be a part of this debate. We cannot throw that baby out with any bathwater. So once we agree that we are debating the same history, we must ask, are we willing to talk about the future? In 1968, when President Johnson met with George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, he did not dwell on the past or the present. He talked about the future. Listen, George, he reportedly said in his southern drawl, don't think about 1968, think about 1988. You and me will be dead and gone by then. So what do you want left after you when you die? Do you want a great big marble monument that reads George Wallace, he built something? Or do you want a scrawny little pine board laying across that hard soil that reads George Wallace, he hated others? I've spoken with Palestinians and Jews, both of whom believe the only possible peaceful future for the Middle East is one where the other doesn't exist. They have succumbed to an attitude of hate. If we are to shine a new light upon Zion, we must shine it by refusing to let this narrative take hold. When I visited Israel for the first time 20 years ago, hopes were as high as ever. Public schools were starting programs where Israelis and Palestinians were in class together. They were becoming a unified community. Palestinian and Israeli leadership were beginning to trust each other and work together. But since that time, much of this trust has been lost, and some of the infrastructure built has been dismantled. But not all of it. 3 years ago, when our congregation visited Israel, we visited the hand-in-hand school system. It's the equivalent of what we would call a charter school, where Arab and Jewish Israelis go to school together. They learn each other's languages. They celebrate each other's lives. One need look no further, in fact, than the recent Israeli election, in which the far right came together with the far left to form a coalition that includes an Islamic party. We cannot shine a new light on Zion by focusing on the past. To shine a new light, we must highlight a future that Israelis and Palestinians can both be proud of. But we aren't going to hear that from late-night talk show hosts like John Oliver, politicians like Bernie Sanders. There won't be a Ben & Jerry's ice cream flavor highlighting our hopes for a shared future. Those voices have to be ours. And given the megaphones that some people have in this world and their will to take advantage of our most vulnerable moments, we must raise those voices loudly and often. We have been invited to hear some of these voices, the voices that will speak of the future. I encourage you to amplify them in the coming weeks. We've been invited by Temple Road of Shalom in Falls Church, Virginia, to join them and other congregations for a series of discussions that they rightly term the Israeli-Palestinian Dilemma, moving beyond who's right and who's wrong. With thanks to our small group News for Jews, this program is being subsidized for any member of Temple Israel to participate. You'll receive an email in the coming weeks, and I hope that you'll register. The conference is being held over 3 meetings, all on Zoom, and we hope to hold an in-person meeting following it so that we can discuss what we've learned and how we can amplify our voices. Let's avoid this crash by being part of moving beyond who's right and who's wrong. I want to close with words that began the state of Israel. In 1948, on the verge of war, just moments away, Zionist leaders sat in the basement of a building and wrote a moral document, one of the greatest future-focused moral documents in all of Jewish history. We'd be wise to read it often and to emulate it now. Here's what they said. We will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its citizens, all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and we extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East. The very first voice of the modern state of Israel was the moral voice of Zionism. Millennial Zionists, their grandparents, and everyone in between, we have so missed this voice, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's being drowned out by accusation and defensive rebuttal. We've missed this voice because too often we only speak of survival and not of growth. One survives by building tall walls, but one grows by shining lights. Or Chadash, Al Tzion Ta'ir, it is time to shine a new light on our beloved homeland of Zion. V'nizkeh kulanu mehera le'oro, that we may all swiftly merit its radiance as it shines back on us. Let's be this voice, the voice of a humbling history, of a vibrant future, of the advancement of all peoples in this place we love. From wherever you sit and whoever you may sit with, I hope you'll join me in being such a voice for Zionism. May we come together across generations, across all the boundaries that have been placed in our world, so that our people and all people can benefit from the light that emanates from Zion, from Israel, from the place we love and that loves us. Amen.